play a video now?
James is 11 years old. Like many boys his age, he is easily captivated by video games which may hold his attention for long periods of time.
Same thing. Nice. I can't do that. Yeah. Do it in the next spot.
Also, like many children his age, he finds everyday tasks like homework are not nearly as stimulating. But James' inability to focus on activities like homework is much more serious than it is for most other children. James is also impulsive. He has a hard time controlling his emotions and his behavior, and that has led to problems for him and his family.
When he was 9 months old, we went to some friends' house, and rather than sit on the couch or sit in our laps like some of the other children, he was climbing up the back of the chair and pulling a cord that hung their lamp on the wall, and he pulled that down and it broke. Just lots of busy activities. And throughout the years, the early months, the pediatrician kept telling us that he was quick-minded.
Look at these chapters.
Over the next 5 years, James' quick-minded and aggressive behaviors continued and intensified. He had trouble at home and in preschool. It was hard for him to follow instructions and to make friends. These problems were puzzling as well as painful for his parents.
Finally, in first grade, the teacher confided in me and said, I'm really not supposed to tell you this because this is, we really have to go through the ed plan and do the formalities of this. But my nephew has attention deficit disorder, and I think that's what your son has too.
Some 3% of children may have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, characterized by a number of symptoms.
When we talk about ADHD, we're talking about a disorder where children exhibit a number of very distinct symptoms, one of which is developmentally inappropriate inattention. The child doesn't attend to tasks. The child doesn't attend to teacher. The child doesn't follow instructions, etc. Another symptom is impulsivity. Here we have a child who doesn't complete homework, for example, who switches from one task to another, who talks out of turn, who responds before questions are actually finished. Again, a quality of impulsivity. The third symptom, which may be the most notable, is hyperactivity. Here a child is always moving around. A child is unable to stay in a seat. A child may fidget. A child is always active.
James's symptoms were so severe that his mother brought him here to the Center for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center. But making a finding of ADHD poses some problems. Dr. Russell Barkley is the center's founder.
Probably the greatest difficulty is trying to distinguish between what is typical of normal children, particularly normal boys, and what is typical of these children. Many studies indicate that up to 40 to 50% of normal boys are described as restless and inattentive and impulsive. The best way we have of determining whether this child is ADHD or deviant is using the reports of parents and teachers, such as on a behavior rating scale or questionnaire, and comparing that to what teachers say about normal children of that age. That gives us a measure of just how far from normal this child falls in his ratings of behavior by these people.
One problem with diagnosis is that many children with ADHD see the clinical evaluation as an opportunity to perform. They pay greater attention and score better than they would under normal circumstances. Dr. Arthur Anastopoulos is the center's director.
You need to keep in mind that when you evaluate children in the clinic, the more novel one-to-one it is, the less likely you'll see ADHD. So our job for them is to create situations that are relatively uninteresting, boring, if you will, of long enough duration, that have a chance of eliciting ADHD symptomatology.
One of the evaluation techniques is called the Restricted Academic Situations Task. Here, a child is asked to work on math problems over a period of 15 minutes. Dr. George DuPaul explains the procedure while observing James through a one-way mirror.
Okay, what we're looking for is how well Jamie pays attention to this work, and also how fidgety and restless he might be during the time that he's working on this, how often he might get out of his seat or play with objects in the room that have nothing to do with the task itself. So what we end up with during this 15-minute observation is a percentage of time that Jamie is paying attention to his work, as well as a percentage of the time that he's fidgety and restless and out of his seat and doing other behaviors that might be related to attention deficit disorder.
In less than 5 minutes, James begins to exhibit some ADHD behaviors, including some apparent frustration and anger. As Dr. DuPaul tracks the number of incidents and when they occur, James quickly reaches the limits of his attention span.
You'll notice, too, that Jamie was better able to pay attention during the earlier part of this observation, and now as we're approaching the 8 or 9 minute mark of this observation, his attention has really diminished significantly.
Well, certainly the behavior that we observed during that restricted task would be in the abnormal range, and probably in the mild to moderate end of the abnormal range. Some of the children come in the clinic with, in fact, even more restless, more out of their seat, maybe complete even fewer problems than he did. He was at least able to complete 3 out of the 5 pages, I believe, and those were done fairly accurately. So in his case, accuracy was not as much of a problem, but was the problem was the total productivity, if you will.
If you have an attention deficit, then you ought to be having trouble any time you're asked to pay attention to something. And yet, they're good with Nintendo, they're lousy at homework. What explains those differences? There have been a few theories around that have suggested that this could develop out of purely social circumstances. Those primarily pertain to either bad parenting or to the degree of stress and change in our society, what you might call the tempo of modern life. We now know that this disorder is not due to how your parents are raising you.
For more than 50 years, the precise cause of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder has remained unknown. Although several theories have been offered, some have suggested that the behaviors related to ADHD have their roots in a specific part of the brain, the frontal lobe.
The centers of the brain that control motivation, how sensitive you are to your world and especially the consequences that happen to you, seems to be not working well in these children. It makes them less sensitive then to the things that would motivate a normal child to behave. So we are now coming around to looking at ADHD as a deficit, a biological deficit in motivation. And that seems to explain where they'll do well and where they won't. You can now predict that under a highly motivating situation, where they enjoy what they're doing, where there is some immediate consequence, such as the promise of money or chips or toys for getting that work done, these children will have no trouble with that. But it also predicts the opposite, where there is no consequence for doing your work, where the work you're asked to do is boring and protracted over long periods of time, for instance, and the consequences for what you do are in the future, in the long run. These children will have substantial problems.
Stimulant drugs, such as dexedrine or Ritalin, are often prescribed to help manage the symptoms and related behaviors. But one might question, as many have in recent years, why a stimulant is being prescribed for a child like James, who is already overactive. Dr. Barkley has a theory on why this works.
For many decades, professionals thought that these drugs did something opposite to these children, paradoxical, you might say, than they did to normal children. And the belief was that if you gave a normal child a stimulant, you would excite him and make him hyperactive. And yet if you gave a hyperactive child this drug, it seemed to calm them down and make them concentrate. We now know that both of those are completely misconception. First of all, we have given these drugs to normal children in a few experiments at the National Institute of Mental Health, for instance, and found that normal children get better too. Not as much, because they weren't as deviant in their behavior, But the direction of change is identical to that seen in normal children. Better concentration, less fidgeting, better impulse control, and better work productivity than we would see in the child off medicine. The second thing is that we've discovered that hyperactive children do not have a brain that is overactive, and therefore the stimulant calms it down. They actually have a certain part of their brain, as I said, that is underactive, sleepy, sluggish. And this drug seems to have a particular affinity for going to that part of the brain and activating it. Now, that part of the brain is the one responsible for inhibiting behavior, for focusing your concentration, and for suppressing activity level, especially unwanted activity level. As one parent says, what you're doing is stimulating his brake lines in his brain so that you're activating the very part of the brain that's involved in inhibiting and controlling behavior.
Sometimes problems within the family system can contribute to ADHD behavior. So in addition to medication, family therapy or individual therapy may be necessary. But educating the parents is almost always essential.
You cannot raise one of these children properly if you don't fully understand what this child has, and particularly that the child struggles with a disability, that this is not willful misbehavior of an otherwise normal child. That education involves teaching them about the symptoms of the disorder, what causes it, what is likely to happen as these children grow up, and also tries to work with the parents in understanding that it's not their fault either. Trying to bring them around to the idea that normal things that can be used with typical children are not going to be as successful at helping to manage and raise such a child. Some children respond to a reprimand, where you can turn to them and you can say, Catherine, stop doing that. Or Steve or Ken or whatever, stop that. And they'll stop. Your kids, you could say that till the cows come home, and it's not going to stop what's going on. You have to get up and confront them.
The methods used to help parents better manage the child with ADHD are typically based on behavior modification concepts. One common method is called a token economy, in which a child receives poker chips for good behavior. These tokens may be cashed in for treats, toys, or privileges.
A few years ago, we were going to California for 2 weeks, and both my children were on that. And then what I did was at the end, they could trade back the chips for a nickel a piece or whatever, so they each had spending money to go to California. And that was the most peaceful time during that time, which would have been an otherwise crazy time for us. It was difficult to implement in the beginning, and it took a lot of practice, but once we actually used it, we perfected the system pretty much, and we had to carry poker chips with us in the car. The babysitter had to learn how to do it. My mother had to learn how to use it, so that we would be riding with friends in the car, and something would occur, and I'd say, oh, Jamie, here's a chip. And friends would say, potato chips? What are you talking about? And they all got to understand, and sometimes the friends would predict and would say to him, oh, you got a chip for that, oh, you're going to lose a chip. And so everyone was on his case, and it was really successful. It worked out well.
What do we call it? Excuse me. Look at me. Well, you're getting points for what today? Of course, but when I say to you, I ask you a question, right? Yeah. You just get the answer like that. You don't have to give me all the reasons why. Okay? You're going to swallow your voice.
Children with ADHD not only have problems at home, but also at school. Unrecognized and left untreated, a child with ADHD runs the risk of a multitude of problems with schoolwork, teachers, and other students.
Oh, nice job. Okay.
Pat Henningsen is a special ed teacher who works with children with behavioral problems such as ADHD. She began working with the University of Massachusetts psychologists 3 years ago.
Basically teaching them to tune into themselves at every moment of the day, just to stop and think, look at the situation and come up with a plan. Because if they don't, that's when, they're so impulsive and there's just so much going on. It's so difficult for them to focus. Things can go wrong. I mean, at times it's comical because you just watch things fall down and papers falling all over the place, and you just look at them like they're looking at you like, I need to do it. And they do.
What am I supposed to do? When we have group time training, what are we supposed to do? We listen. What else?
We review the rules. We pick a target behavior.
You wait till you have everything complete when you're talking to someone who
You see how busy the walls are? saying is like, because it's harder for kids to sustain things up here, you usually need to put boards and rules on the wall so you can constantly prompt the kids to externally see.
They have to be continuously reminded. They also have to be continuously reminded that there is a goal, and at the end of the day, they'll achieve this goal. But the immediacy is the token.
Poker chips are given to reinforce positive behaviors. This is most effective when they're given almost immediately.
The main focus is to really encourage them to behave, to do the proper thing. I think the misunderstanding of behavior not is that, they're only doing it because they know they're going to get something out of it, but it's not true. Because they do learn to tune into their own behaviors, to tune into the proper behaviors, and to tune into the wrong behaviors, and accept the consequence for it and learn from the consequence.
Despite advances in understanding and managing attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, only about 1 in 5 children will outgrow the disorder. Those that don't may be vulnerable to a range of problems, including difficulties getting through school, or holding a job, or maintaining relationships. Others may have trouble with substance abuse, and about 1 in 4 will develop serious antisocial behavior marked by repeated arrests.
The disorder is one that's very curious because although it seems to have a biological cause to it in many cases, the outcome of the children as they grow older is purely the result of social circumstances. So how well you're doing in adulthood or how poorly you're doing has very little to do with how severe your problems were in childhood or what your causes of your disorder are. Instead, it has a lot more to do with how your family chose to deal with your problems, whether they understood that you had a developmental disorder, whether they used a great deal of punishment and control and discipline, or whether they were very sensitive to your problems. And although they tried to structure your life, they were not over-controlling and excessively punitive with you.
Are there enough flowers and vases in the 2 boxes?
No. Yes.
You have to answer yes or no, probably. So solve this information.
The outcome for James is unknown, but his best chance for overcoming his disorder comes from the nurturing and structured environment in which he lives.
You hear such gloomy pictures out there about all of these children and all of these things could potentially happen to them. And a lot of times it does, even with the training or a supportive parent. But I think monitoring things closely as we do, we monitor the medication, we're looking into programs on a regular basis, and I'm closely involved with him, and I hope that that combination will help him be successful.
A more violent, disruptive behavior disorder is
Questions or comments? What percentage of kids have ADHD? Yeah, put down 3 to 5%. They said 3%, but different studies have found different rates. Boys are at least twice as likely. Other studies even find up to 4 times as likely as girls to have ADHD. So the boys are up to 10% of them possibly have ADHD or ADD in childhood. One theory that an evolutionary psychologist puts forward about, well, why are there gender differences in ADD and in general, about ADD in general, why does it exist? It kind of goes back to what I was saying about the kind of schooling and that Panksepp quote. But they think that ADD is potentially a product of kind of like evolution and being hunter-gatherers with men being more hunters and having evolved to be hunters and do kind of physical and kind of motor activities more, and that was what was needed for survival. This, by the way, is not generally accepted, although it's interesting to think about. It's not that it's been disconfirmed. It's just hard to prove. There's a lot of evolutionary theories one way or the other. But the idea is that maybe men, particularly in hunting kind of societies, were evolved a certain way, and now that they're kind of made to sit still in classrooms, that's where you see these symptoms of ADD. You don't see, it's a mismatch between the way they were kind of bred for thousands of years and what they're asked of now. What are the symptoms? The same person actually also suggests that Asian societies were more pastoral than, say, European or African societies, and that partially explains why you see slightly greater rates of ADD in European or African societies than Asian. Again, this is all speculative, but it's kind of interesting theory. What are the symptoms of ADHD? We already went over that. Hyperactivity, impulsivity, attention deficits. How is ADHD diagnosed? Behavior rating scales, in particular teachers and parents against norms. Like that thing where they had the kid do the math problems and the kid was pounding on the phone. Things like that, or even just having kids play with toys on the floor, are often used, but those are more kind of subjective from the psychologist's point of view, unlike these questionnaires which have been normed across the country, like that thing with using the, there's no norm for how long it takes a kid to start pounding on the phone, across the country for kids that are 10 years old, like it actually was. But those, it's not just questionnaires, it's typically other tasks to kind of elicit this to see if, because that's one thing with ADD too, is that you would expect to see in multiple contexts, school, home, and then even when you come into a therapy office or a research office, you would expect to see difficulties in those different domains. And if you don't see difficulties in the different domains to kind of dull tasks, then that might suggest something about it being more contextual and something about your teacher and the way your teacher handles your class, or your parents and the way your parents handle you, rather than something that's kind of intrinsic to you. Right, so you saw the kid kind of like, what did he do? He started crumbling up the desk. But you could kind of see, the kid that was crumbling up the paper, well, first he was pounding on the phone, he was hitting the buttons, and then he slammed it down, and then he was like crumbling up his papers. He was obviously getting frustrated. There's probably multiple things going on there. One is he's having a hard time doing the problem, so he's getting frustrated. His hard time doing the problems, though, is probably a reflection both of just in general, and I'll make an assumption here because I don't know about this kid in the video, that he's probably has had a hard time learning math problems. Addition looked like he was doing addition or subtraction, or maybe multiplication, I don't know, some sort of problems on the sheet. But so maybe he is delayed in terms of being able to do those. At the same time, so that's kind of like a historical thing, but then at the current time, he was probably also understimulated by having to sit there with nobody else in the room and doing those. So some of the frustration was probably fueled by that. I know for myself that like when I'm tired or sick, when my motivations are low, I can find myself like self-stimulating like that kid, by pounding on things. But I do it like sometimes I like just talk to myself. I mean, not like at length, but like, if I find when I'm sick, I'm like moping around the house, like you're sitting on the couch or whatever, but I know I need to get up and do something. Like, come on, get up, But it's kind of, I think it's probably related to somewhat what's going on with attention deficit kids. Not just when they're sick or tired, but kind of because of their way their brain is. And we're going to get that in a second, but just kind of needing to create self-stimulation to stay interested in what they're doing. Where does Barclay believe the roots of ADHD lie? Who caught that? Huh? The roots of ADHD? Bad parenting. Frontal lobe. Bad parenting? No. In fact, he made a point of not saying it was not that. Frontal lobe, which is the center of motivation, and is also called the Executive Center. I want you to know that term, Executive Center. And like I said at the outset, this whole kind of self-regulation idea, we've been talking about ADD, which is on this end, but it informs this end of the spectrum of people just as much. I know there was a study of Yale graduates, undergraduates, leaving Yale, asking them did they have a 10-year plan? What was their plan for what they were doing after graduation? Well, and this is at least probably 20 years ago. I believe this was done in the 80s. Those 10% of graduates who had a solid 10-year plan for what they were going to do, well, they actually followed them up 10 years later, and those 10% had 90% of the wealth of all the graduating class. And so this executive functioning and the ability to set goals is not related just to sitting still and doing your homework, but also on a larger scale, it's related to, can you set goals in life, go towards them, and it means a lot for success, whether your success is financial or whatever you want out of life, helping kids, doing whatever, helping the rainforest, being able to set goals and kind of keep your eye on that and take steps towards it is kind of a life success thing. We need to stop. We'll finish going over this on Monday. Okay, we were going over the ADHD video, going over the answers. We had 24. What is the process by which Ritalin or dexedrine helps a kid with ADHD? You got that? Yeah.
Less active, but really they're just something more organized and controlled.
Okay, so it's a paradoxical effect. It's actually a stimulant that seems to be increasing something, even though the ADHD kids' behaviors seem like you want to slow something down. Not exactly sure. There's two main biological kind of brain things that may be going on. Probably dopamine, which is a chemical, like your neurons, like the messages between neurons in your brain. Like dopamine is a chemical that kind of crosses the synapse that sends a message. Well, with ADHD kids, this thing that kind of pulls dopamine out of the, it's called a transporter. It's called, it reuptakes the chemical from the neuron. It kind of keeps it back out of this kind of the synaptic opening there. That they have, in fact, overactive transporters, meaning pulling up dopamine. So there's not as much kind of like floating dopamine in a sense. And so that, in fact, that they have lower levels, and that's part of this, I think I mentioned this, like, stimulation threshold, that they actually need more external stimulation, which has an effect on dopamine kind of in the brain. And so, for example, there's some evidence that if you give ADHD kids low levels of stimulation that's not distracting, but say putting on music in the background when they try to study or in class, or I've even heard of people that put like Christmas lights in a classroom or along the top rim of the room, and they just kind of like flash, not distractingly, but just kind of provide a little visual stimulation in the background. That things like that can help ADHD kids focus because it's kind of getting their stimulation threshold closer to where like the rest of us typically are. And it's something that actually there's at least one study with music, that background music, again, you don't want to put on something that draws attention to itself, like death metal or something like that, but like something that kind of, actually for myself I know, and what I was going to say is that there's at least some evidence that it doesn't distract kind of non-ADHD types. And in fact, I think, again, like what we're going to talk about, we are talking about Ritalin, like how we're all on a continuum. I know for myself, I have this like CD of like Gregorian chant, or a CD, that just, you know, it can play for hours, and I can be reading something, and I don't even know that it's on. I mean, I'm not processing at all what's going on, like auditorily. But yet I find myself, like, you know, finding myself going back over things less. Like I said before, your eyes are going across the page and you realize you haven't read it. I do that less if I have something like that or some sort of, you know, subtle background music while I'm studying. And I don't have ADHD. If anything, I'm probably on the. In fact, just last week, I was at some friends. We were in Columbia having dinner, and the waitress was like all over the place. You know, like hard to get her attention, but then she was just very bubbly, and she tells us, we were joking around with her, she's like, tells us she has ADHD, and then my friend goes, well, I have ASUD. He's like, I've got attention surplus underactive disorder, meaning, and actually to some extent a lot of us maybe fit that, meaning like we can sit there and concentrate on things for a long time without like being distracted by external things. Ritalin, how many of you have either for ADHD reasons or not, like tried Ritalin or Dexedrine? And what are the effects like?
I've been on some form of Ritalin since the first grade, consistently, everything you think of, and form of it. And it helped me so much. Not that I can't function without it, but it's much more energy. It makes me more tired to study. It takes more focus. The thing that I also have behavioral therapy, which is they teach you how to study and what it feels like to be concentrated. So I am capable of functioning without it, and it helps dramatically if I do have it. But because I've been on it for so long, I'm part of the I take blood tests like every month to make sure that like the liver and kidneys and stuff are functioning because I've been on it for such a long time. Such a pretty high dose and my mom is a principal at a school, and it's mostly learning disabled private school, and I can't even tell you a substitute teach there. It makes such a huge difference for these kids, and it's not even necessarily studying, because some of them are too young to study, but behavioral stuff and the amount of time that they can sit, Montessori, choice work, they can sit and focus on work significantly for most of the children.
Yeah. How many people have friends like here that, not for ADHD reasons, but have taken Ritalin or Dexedrine just to help them study for exams? Or even in high school with people like that? I mean, it's an issue that, you know, these drugs have gotten so popular that they're available, and people take them just to study. And a lot of people, or most people, again, the whole idea of kind of being on a continuum of how able you are to focus, you know, it's going to help everybody to some extent. Even if you're here instead of out here, it might put you up here in terms of being able to focus and study. Now, it certainly does have side effects as well. The main thing that parents, I think, say when their kids are put on it is, my kid has become a zombie and and has lost like zest for life. You know, kind of not as active. They kind of miss the playful, maybe a little too overactive kid. And it does have it can have other kind of effects on appetite and sleep. But as far as we know, it doesn't have long-term effects, you know, like negative long-term effects on kids. Another kind of sobering thing as a psychologist is that it is, in fact, the case that it's the most powerful thing we know to help focus attention. That even really good behavior therapy with the family, helping the parents kind of figure out a reward system at home, like we saw in the video, like the teacher with the little tokens and stuff like that, but figuring out a comprehensive reward system at home, that the medication actually is better at least the attention part of things and making overnight changes in that for kids. The biggest study, this is in the overheads, which we're not going to have time to go through the whole study, but part of the overheads of what the lecture I was going to do on ADHD, if we had time to finish it, was the biggest study by the federal government is looked at with hundreds of kids, the effects of stimulant medication versus like intensive different kind of behavioral treatments, meaning working with the parents, working with the teachers to come up with reward systems for the kid, and also kind of a individual tutoring for the kid. Looking at those two things combined, and then looking at like nothing at all. But it wasn't actually nothing at all. It was like whatever the kid would get if it wasn't for this study. So if their parents went and got a counselor at school to get involved, that was part of that. But the outcomes of that study are that in terms of attention symptoms, that the medication alone and medication plus the behavioral treatment, the reward systems, were the two groups that showed the best improvement. The medication plus the behavioral reward systems were not higher in terms of getting better attention in the kids than medication by itself. So medication by itself was as powerful as also having all this reward system. Now the one thing though that did and the behavioral reward system without medication was not as good at reducing or improving kids' abilities to focus attention. So as a psychologist, that's kind of sobering because I at one point in my life I was thinking, do I want to go into psychology? Do I want to go into psychiatry? The main difference being going to med school and being a psychiatrist is you can prescribe drugs, and I, as a psychologist, can't. And it was because at the time I was into kind of talk therapy and what can we do to work with families and kids to improve their lives. But ADHD is one case in which medication is, does have a benefit. It can do things that just working with the family can't. Or at least that's the evidence to date suggests that. Now I should say though, and this relates to question 7, there was that I was saying how the medication by itself versus medication versus behavioral treatment were the same in terms of attention symptoms, but you did see some better kind of reduction in anxiety in kids with the behavioral systems, working with the family. And that relates to this question, like, well, what does Barkley think determines whether a kid will persist in having difficulties? Even though the origins, he clearly says, seem to be biological, he says family processes are the strongest predictors of long-term success. Now, that's not necessarily with attention and the ability to study, but in terms of whether they're going to have other kinds of problems, like getting along with other kids and develop anxiety, depression, conduct disorder, those kind of things. That is something that that families and parents can influence, but the ability to pay attention is going to be a lifelong kind of issue for a kid with ADHD. And that's another thing about Ritalin is it's not a cure. You have to keep taking it. Like once it wears off, you don't necessarily. In fact, you're not likely to. You need to keep taking it for it to have its effect. Do children outgrow ADHD? 1 in 5, and so that's kind of consistent with what I just said, which is it's going to be, if you have this attention deficit, it's going to be something that kind of stays with you, and it's going to be a lifelong thing that you have to be aware of and think about it. So we think of it as a disability. And how many will have antisocial personality disorder? 1 in 4. So again, like I said before, a lot of the kids with attention problems then become conduct problems. Okay, let's